Good evening. On behalf of President Susan Herbst and Vice Provost for Global Affairs Daniel Wiener at the University of Connecticut, I would like to welcome you to this very special event to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. My name is Yuhan Rong. I'm the Assistant Vice Provost for Global Affairs, standing in for my boss, Dan, who has 3 fractured ribs tonight. So he just came back from Hong Kong and Korea, so he sends his apologies. When I went to school in China many years ago, my teachers often reminded me, history, if not forgotten, is a guide for the future. So thanks to Alice K. Norian endowment tonight, we have an opportunity to face a significant, yet often silent, if not forgotten, chapter of human history. It is our hope that the lessons of the Armenian Genocide will guide us when we try to understand today's conflicts in the world and to ensure that the past guides our future. I would like to acknowledge the Armenian American Community in Connecticut, Professor Armen Marsoobian, various collections of Armenian artifacts, and those at UConn Global Affairs who have made tonight's event and exhibition a success. In particular, may I acknowledge Zara Ali, our Director of Communications and Partnerships, the woman who single-handedly made this evening possible. So join me. I went off the script. She worked very hard for her, and she was meticulous, paid attention to details, and she has an attitude that nothing is impossible. And I actually doubted last year this would ever happen, and she taught me a lesson. And also, I would like to acknowledge Ms. Carolyn Golden. Carolyn, where are you? Carolyn. And she works in our office, and she is dedicated in the university's role in promoting global understanding, and her constant willingness to help and her ability to turn ideas into reality. Tonight's reality, Carolyn, are you. And finally, we have 2 wonderful students. So here at the university, we make our students work. So we have Ms. Amber Lee. She has this incredible talent for photography and sharp eyes, as sharp as a professional museum curator. And I'm trying to tell her she has a career in front of her that she may not have ever planned. The Met Museum of Art. And Jadil Cruz. Jadil, where are you? You're outside, and he is our graduate student for his support and perspective to shape the exhibit together. And tonight, it is an honor and privilege for the university to present our 2 very distinguished guests, author Chris Bohjalian and Professor Armen Marsoobian. Mr. Bohjalian, as you know, in many books outside, is the author of 17 books, including 10 New York Times bestsellers. His books have been translated into 30 languages and 3 times become films. He has won many literary awards, and his books have been chosen as the best book of the year by the Washington Post and many other publications. Professor Marsoobian teaches philosophy at Southern Connecticut State University and twice served as the Bohjalian Visiting Professor for Armenian Studies at Columbia University. He won the Herendijk Prize of Historical Research in 2011 for his work on Armenian Genocide. As a novelist and a historian, our guests tonight have brought us a historical fiction, The Sandcastle Girls, and a personal history documents of the genocide, Fragments of a Lost Homeland, Remembering Armenia. Through their conversation this evening, we will embark on a journey through fiction and memoir, and they're here to ensure that the history is no longer silent and forgotten. So I would also like to introduce to you Professor Daniel Adler of Anthropology at UConn. And Professor Adler is going to facilitate the post-conversation questions and answers. So you want to know who is that Professor Adler? So I told him I'm going to make up all that stuff about him. So in the 1920s, when I was growing up, when I was in school in China, in the 1920s, I was taught in the 1920s there were archaeologists who discovered Peking Man. So that was a very important archaeological piece of history in China. So for today, actually, Professor Adler is an archaeologist of the same importance. Recently, he and his colleagues examined a newly excavated site in Armenia dated 325,000 to 350,000 years ago, and discovered that human technological innovation occurred intermittently throughout the old world rather than spreading from a single point of origin as originally we believed before. So this is a significant archaeological discovery. So in a word, what does that mean? That means, to the surprise of today's everything generation standing right there, technological innovation started long before the era of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Professor Adler's findings were published last year in the most prestigious journal, Science. So without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Bohjalian and Professor Marsoobian. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. It is a pleasure, it is an honor, it is a privilege to be here at the University of Connecticut and to be sharing the dais with these two extraordinary gentlemen. And it's really important for a Chris Bohjalian to be back at UConn. There hasn't been one here since December, when my nephew, Chris Bohjalian, finished here at this illustrious university. I also have to tell you that it is extraordinary for me to be the opening act, so to speak, for Armin Marsoobian's Fragments of a Lost Armenia. I read this book last month, and it is spectacular. It is among the smartest, most poignant, most precise examinations of the Armenian Genocide I've ever read. It is a perfect example of where scholarship meets the soul. I just revere this book and the photographs that are in there. And one other footnote. I lectured about the Armenian Genocide in Istanbul in 2013. I was lecturing in a room surrounded by the photographs of the Dillion family, or Armen's family photographs from 100 years ago. Given what we're talking about today, I thought I would talk about the Sandcastle Girls in the context of real and imagined, where does fact meet fiction, and very specifically, why did I structure the book the way that I structured it? And because we're going to be looking at a lot of photographs tonight, I thought I would begin with the oldest family photograph in the Bohjalian family archives. Kayseri, tail end of the 19th century, the Bohjalian family. And I would love to draw your attention to two of the players in this photograph. The little boy on his father's lap, that is my grandfather, Levon Nazareth Bohjalian. His father, Nazareth Bedros. We will come back to Nazareth a little bit later, but now let's skip ahead 35 to 37 years to New York City. The little boy has grown up. He is now the patriarch. And this is my father and my grandparents, and it is my favorite photograph I have of my father. I love everything about it. The short pants, the big wide ears, the necktie that falls 3 inches above his navel. Standing behind him, my beautiful grandmother, Haigui Shodinian Bohjalian, and just for the record, you will meet other Shodinians in Fragments of a Lost Armenia. Related, maybe, maybe not. Whenever I look at this picture of Haigui Shodinian, I see wisps of my beautiful 21-year-old daughter, Grace Experience. And sitting beside them, well, there's that little boy now grown up, Levon Nazareth. He's wearing a suit. In my memories of my grandfather when I was a little boy visiting him in Westchester County, New York, he was always wearing a suit. I remember once asking his daughter, my Aunt Rosemary, I said, Aunt Rosemary, when you were a little girl growing up, was Grandpa always wearing a suit? And she laughed and laughed and said, no, Chris, of course not. I remember one day when he was cleaning the oil burner, he took off his jacket. Leo, as he would come to be called in the United States, and Haigui were survivors of the Armenian Genocide. Like so many survivors, they took most of their stories to their graves. We know bits and pieces. We know that my grandmother, Haigui Shodinian, her father provided cavalry horses to the Ottoman army and had for years. In 1915, rather than acquire the horses legally, they simply shot him to death, confiscated the herd, confiscated the horse farm, and then for good measure, confiscated the Shodinian home. My grandfather, Leo, he had 3 brothers. In 1915, against all odds, all 4 male siblings were alive and in Cairo. And yet somehow, between 1915 and the mid-1920s, when my grandparents wed in Paris, all 3 of his brothers would be lost to the mists of history. To this day, we do not know what happened to them. We do not know how to explain their death or disappearance. Now, The Sandcastle Girls is not the first time that I tried to write a novel of the Armenian Genocide. Tried once before in 1993. Wrote the entire book, 392 manuscript pages. And when I finished reading it, I realized it was utterly unpublishable, a train wreck. So I sent the manuscript to my alma mater in Western Massachusetts, where my papers are archived. And to this day, if you're a scholar or a masochist, you can go there and read it. But I would discourage you from going there because it really is a bad book. Why didn't it work? Well, first of all, it didn't work because it was rich in the numbers of the ways our people were ethnically cleansed from the Anatolian plains, but it was weak in character. It was filled with the places such as Deir Zor that all of us in the Armenian American community know, but people outside of the Armenian American community could not find on a map. The ruins, and some of these are photographs that I took in Western Armenia over the past few years. This is a particular monastery not far from Lake Van. The ruins were always out of context, and the skulls and the bones were always nameless. These are skulls and bones taken from Deir Zor. You can see them in Antelius at the Armenian Genocide Memorial Chapel there. Every page, it seemed, had another massacre. The men were constantly bloodied. The women were constantly abducted, kidnapped, raped, Islamized. It might have been cathartic for a young novelist. It might have been a great exercise in a 30-year-old Armenian American venting his rage, but it wasn't a novel. So why did I try again 16 years later in 2010? Well, first of all, because the story is so important. There is a direct link between the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian killing fields, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur. And secondly, because while today, the second is because while today the Armenian Genocide has become, as my narrator calls it in the book, The Sandcastle Girls, the slaughter you know next to nothing about. Once upon a time, of course, all North American eyes were turned in horror upon the fraying edges of the Ottoman Empire and looking on aghast. There were those best-selling books, some of which I just flashed forward. The New York Times alone ran 154 articles off the front page, culminating in the July 13th, 1919 article about the conviction for crimes against humanity and the death sentence for the three architects of the genocide, Talat, Jamal, and Enver Pasha. But of course, the news cycles moved on. The fledgling nation-state of Armenia would be subsumed by the Soviet Union. There's the rise of Nazi Germany. There's the Great Depression. And in 1923, there was the second post-war Turkish government, the Ataturk government, that with Stalin-like fanaticism and brilliance swept under the rug the systematic annihilation of 1.5 million Armenians during and immediately after the First World War. So I knew if I was going to try again to write this particular novel, I would need to approach it very differently than I had in the past. First of all, I needed a narrator. So I began by creating a female version of me, Laura Petrosyan, Armenian-American novelist at midlife who knows far too little of her own ancestry. And why do I need her? Well, because this is the slaughter you know next to nothing about, and I needed a narrator who essentially could provide the Armenian Genocide for dummies. Replace the word ukulele with Armenian Genocide, replace the guitar with an oud. And you can see what Laura Petrosyan's role is. She can explain to the North American reader what occurred. And that was important to me, because I wasn't writing this book for the Armenian American community. We know the stories. Our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents endured the stories. I was writing it for readers in Jacksonville and Indianapolis and Denver, Colorado, who could not find Aleppo on a map. So that was Laura Petrosyan's first role in the book, the Armenian Genocide for Dummies. But she also serves a second function. She's able to say to readers, there's a reason you've not heard of this genocide. And it's not because you're stupid, it's not because you're uneducated, it's because of denial. It's because of a century of Turkish governmental denial. This is actually a photograph of an op-ed I had in the Boston Globe 2 weeks ago, yesterday, about this very issue. Turkey's continued denial, even now, on the centennial of the start of the Armenian Genocide. And so that essentially was really important in the structure of the book. But the other thing was this. No one wants to read a novel about 1.5 million dead in the desert. That's a reality. I know I've always loved big, sweeping, epic love stories set in the midst of cataclysm. And so I decided that I was going to write a big, sweeping, epic love story set in Aleppo in 1915 in the midst of the Armenian Genocide. But because I'm writing this for North Americans who are unfamiliar with this part of our story, I decided that my narrator, Laura Petrosyan's grandmother, was going to be an Odar, an American girl, a Boston Brahmin's daughter, Mount Holyoke class of 1915, a red-headed Spitfire, Elizabeth Endicott, who joins the Boston-based Friends of Armenia, ventures to Aleppo, where she falls in love with Armen Petrosyan, an Armenian engineer who is there looking desperately for his beloved wife Karine, his infant daughter Tallinn. And there the two fall in love, and I had very specific models in mind. I was literally thinking of books that I've loved, such as The English Patient, and I put up the movie poster here, not the book, because I want to draw your attention to the biplane. You will see the biplane again in a few minutes. I was thinking of books such as Atonement, big, sweeping, epic love stories set, in this case, before and during the Second World War. But the other thing I wanted to do with it was this. I didn't want another book solely about Armenian victimhood. One of my favorite books growing up was The 40 Days of Musa Dagh.
Mm-hmm.
And so Armin Petrosyan, if you've read the book you will recall, is an avenging angel. He is merciless. And there are, of course, critical historical cameos to his growth, set in, among other places, the Armenian defense of Van. One of the footnotes to the book that isn't examined a lot, but that was very important to me. It was very important to me that Armen Petrosyan is one tough hombre. So that was the structure of the book. But what is also interesting to me tonight, because I'm sharing the dais with Armin Marsoobian, is that it is a photograph that links the present and the past. What draws Laura Petrosyan in 2000 and, well, technically 12, back in time to 1915? It's a photograph she sees first as an undergraduate at the Armenian Library and Museum of America, and then at midlife in an exhibition at Harvard. And when she sees the photograph the second time, it is captioned, and she understands that the woman in this photograph, and it's the sort of photograph that is wrenching, that Armen's own family gave us, she realizes this might be a connection to her past. And that's what links the past and the present. And I've been thrilled with the way that the book, in all of its editions, has captured that romance. This is the UK edition of the Sandcastle Girls, and I've sort of christened it Downton Abbey meets the English Patient. But I wanted to show this to you because you see, there's the biplane, it's back. Or the Norwegian edition, Sandcastle in Aleppo. This was published in January, and I love seeing this Aleppo. It touches my heart. This is the Aleppo of Armen and Elizabeth. This is the Aleppo that our community could have seen as recently as 2010. And now, tragically, it's gone. Most of the overseas editions, however, replicate the American edition. Elizabeth Endicott, woman in white, staring at something in the distance that we know is Der Zor, desert of bones. And that matters to me, and it matters to me when I travel back to Western Armenia to see the ruins of our civilization, to see the areas from which we were ethnically cleansed, once the homes to our reverend fathers, now the homes to seagulls and graffiti. Incidentally, this is the fortress in Van that looks down upon the Rose Quarter where Armen in the novel defends the granary. This is another monastery not far from Van. This is what it looked like when I took a photograph of it in 2013. This is what it looked like 100 years earlier. Most of the time when you travel through Western Armenia, you see that the great hodgepodgers are now buttressing cattle barns, even in places like Diyarbakir, where the Armenian church, Sirp Gedagos, was restored. You go to the cemetery, and you see that the Armenian crypts have been sledgehammered. Finally, there is this notion of denial. This is St. Sarkis. It looks a lot like Ani, and should look like Ani because it's near Ani. It's in the Kars region. But I share this image with you because this was one of 5 churches completely standing and intact in the early 1950s. This is what it looks like today. This is my wife and daughter and my good friend, Hachig Maradian. The reason why I share this with you, 5 to that, is because it was in the 1950s that the Turkish army tried to dynamite all 5 churches in that ledge and in that area. The only reason why St. Sarkis is still standing, as far as my wife can tell, is because they must have run out of dynamite and it was too freaking difficult to climb down that ravine, so they just let it go. It isn't simply enough in a genocide to eliminate or ethnically cleanse the people from the territory. You need to ethnically cleanse any trace that they were ever there. Which brings me to the Dudon crevasse near Chankush. Here's what the history books said happened in Chankush. Over a 3-day period in June of 1915, 10,000 Armenians are marched to the edge of that gorge, and they are all shot, bayoneted, or knifed, stabbed, and their bodies thrown to the bottom, thrown not simply to the bottom of the gorge, but literally thrown to the crevasse in the bottom of the gorge that falls another couple hundred feet, 10,000. When I was there in 2013, when I was leaving the village of Chunkush, a local Kurd, roughly my age, knocked on our van door. There were 7 of us on this particular pilgrimage, and he said, "You have to come meet my mother-in-law. She's 98 years old." Our Kurdish driver was worried this was an abduction of sorts, but 98. 2013, we all did the math. This was a woman who was born in 1915. So we went to meet her, and thank goodness we did, because the history books were wrong. Not every Armenian at the edge of the Dudon crevasse was killed in that 3-day period. A Kurdish member of the killing party thought one particular Armenian woman was so beautiful that he pulled her from the line. She was holding in her arms an infant daughter who was 6 or 7 weeks old. And he married her. And he raised that infant as his own, and she's alive today. Asiya, last living Armenian in Chunkush. And why this story will always haunt me is this. As my friend Hatshig was interviewing her, 2 of the women with us were each holding her hands, a woman named Sarah Jayan and a woman named Naidi Arzumanian. And Asiya kept looking at the 7 of us, and she kept saying, "You're Armenian. You're Armenian. You're really Armenian." And that's when I got it. Her son-in-law was a good man, a very, very good man. It wasn't that he wanted us to meet her. He wanted his mother-in-law, Armenian, to meet us. To see that while she might be the last living Armenian in Chunkush, the race continues. We are still out there. When I returned to see her this past summer, I brought with me my wife and daughter, and it was glorious. Instead of this wrenching, haunting rediscovery, it was a family reunion, and I will see her again this July when I'm venturing to Kayseri. Now, and here's where I want to end. Why am I going to Kayseri? I mentioned Nazareth in the very first slide I showed, my great-grandfather. This past autumn, I came across a very old Armenian encyclopedia. In this very old Armenian encyclopedia was this photograph. You'll recognize it. I did instantly. It is a close-up of Nazareth Bedros Bohjalian. So I gave this encyclopedia to my friend Hatshig to translate for me. All my life, I had assumed that my great-grandfather was a carpenter. He may have dabbled as a writer. We all knew that. He may have dabbled as a writer, but he was a carpenter. No. He was a poet who may have dabbled in carpentry. It is a 5-page section about Nazareth Bedros Bohjalian, a child prodigy at 13 brought from Kayseri to Jerusalem, who was performing between Jerusalem and Constantinople throughout the 1870s, only returning to Kayseri to start his family when he was 30. In his 20s, he was the equivalent of a rock star on the Anatolian plains. His poems, Walt Whitman-like celebrations of Kayseri, his neighbors, people he knew. Think Walt Whitman. Then, however, things changed in 1895. In that prologue to the Armenian Genocide we call the Hamidian Massacres, 250,000 Armenians were slaughtered, and on November 18th, the massacres came to Kayseri. And Nazareth's poetry changed. In 1896, he wrote a 70-quatrain epic about the massacres with these, including these 2 passages. They killed infidels with axes, daggers, and didn't ask who you were, whether merchant or coolie. They took the babies out of the wombs of their mothers, and those who witnessed lost their minds. Instead of thinking Whitman, think Gomitas. He died in 1902, when Levon was a very little boy. And that is why I assume now that his story came down to us in such fragments. The family was scattered first by the Hamidian massacres and then by the genocide. I've always been so proud to be my father's son, to be my grandfather's grandson. But it was only this winter, with the discovery that I am not the first Bohjalian to try to make sense of the Armenian genocide in art. I am but the second, that I've discovered how proud I should be to be the great-grandson of Nazareth Bedros Bohjalian. Thank you.
Trying to wake things up here. And I lost my connected to the laptop. Yeah. I just lost mine. There. Well, while this is while this is warming up here, I'll go a little off script because of the remarks that Chris had made to conclude his talk about Chunkush, because it's also the case that my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother and my grandmother were in Chunkush that November 1895. As a young child, I lived in a room next door to my grandmother, and she slept in the bed just next to our room. And I would notice on occasion when she was going to bed that she had scars, burn scars on the side of her body. And it was only many, many years later that I discovered those scars dated back to that November in 1895, when she was burned as she escaped with her father, a minister, off the roof of their house that was being attacked by the same mob, and witnessed her father, my great-grandfather, Sarkis Nakashan, die there in front of her eyes. I too will be visiting Chunkush, probably this May. So we're discovering all along how we are connected, Chris and I. So let me see why this is still not waking up. I'm going to take this off. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay. I'd like to thank everyone here at UConn who made this possible. You've all heard their names mentioned twice, so I don't want to take up more time. But my sincere thanks for all the hard work they did, the beautiful exhibition displaying many of the family photographs and also the many of the family items. Today, I'm going to speak about my work in the last 4 or 5 years. The title of this presentation, or this event, is Remembering Armenia, A Journey Through Historical Fiction and Memoir. I have sort of a subtitle to my part of the talk, and I'll read this and I'll show you some slides. The subtitle is Why Remember? Bearing Witness and Memorialization in the Case of the Armenian Genocide. Now, the fortuitous conjunction of my prior philosophical work, and as you realize, that was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a philosopher, but I'm also a historian, but mostly a philosopher. But the fortuitous conjunction of my prior philosophical work on memorial art and my research into my family's history in Ottoman Turkey before and during the Armenian Genocide prompted me to explore the moral demands that memory makes on us as individuals and communities. Thus began my personal journey into my family's past, and at the same time a simultaneous intellectual journey, probing the question of what ought I to do with what I learn about the past. I soon came to realize that the stories I uncovered had an important moral dimension. My ancestors, in recording their story in both words and the images you see in the other room, were bearing witness to the unjust suffering and harm that they had undergone. Thus, it became my duty, my moral duty, to tell their story, and by so doing, acknowledge their suffering. Acknowledging suffering is the first step in the process of moral repair that follows upon acts of genocide and crimes against humanity. Yet it soon became clear to me that the audience for my memory work, I call this memory work, must not be restricted to those familiar with the events of 1915, my generally Armenian audiences, nor to those from non-victim societies such as my American audiences. But the audience must also be from the perpetrator society. I have journeyed to Turkey nearly a dozen times in the last few years, and will do so again later this year, in order to continue a memory project that functions on multiple levels, including the aesthetic, the ethical, and most controversially, the political. My project is by definition political because it presents a counter-memory to the government-controlled foundational myth of the Turkish Republic. So my presentation today is in part a progress report on my memory work. I will also explain how my memory work is intended to function and justify it in terms of the concept of bearing witness. Let me first describe the project. There are 3 identifiable interrelated components to the project. For shorthand, I will name these: 1, the photography exhibition; 2, the books, one of which is out there for you to look at; and 3, the memory sites, Since these activities are not confined to Turkey alone, they take on different objectives depending upon the locale. Even within Turkey, we have made changes due to the social and political environment in which we are operating. I have learned in the course of the last few years that Turkey is an extremely diverse country in terms of both social and religious values, political orientation, and ethnic identity. So let me begin with the photography exhibition. As some of you are aware, I come from a family of photographers who worked professionally in the Ottoman Empire, and then in Greece, and then finally in the United States. Over 20 years ago, I inherited a significant portion of the Dillion photography collection from my uncle Hamayag, who lived here in Hartford, Connecticut. Among the thousands of photographs and glass negatives, there were hundreds from the period beginning in 1888 and ending in 1922, to be more precise, in November 1922, the year my family was forced to flee their ancestral homeland in historic Armenia. Through a series of chance encounters, I began a partnership with a Turkish NGO, Anadolu Kültür, that employs the arts and culture to deal with a variety of social justice and human rights issues. One area of their work relates to improving relations between Armenians and Turks, both in their respective republics, but also in the diaspora. Our initial activity was to hold an exhibition in Istanbul in a cultural center that they had created in a converted tobacco warehouse known as Depot. This is the catalog from that exhibition. The exhibition opened on April 25th, 2013, and ran until June. There were panel discussions and speakers associated with the exhibition. Special tours were organized for the Armenian school children, and a variety of human rights groups incorporated the exhibition into their activities. I'll just quickly show you some images. This is an image of our setting up the exhibition. As you see, some of these images are duplicated out in the gallery space and in the hallway. The space we were working in Istanbul was quite large, so we were able to even have larger size photographs. As you can see, these are as tall as the room. And the text, it was heavily textual. It was in Turkish. The photographs had subtitles in Turkish and in English. This is just an example of one of the texts that tells the family story, and these are all based on the memoirs. This is just a translation of one of the panels. There were very few actual photographs at the exhibition, but these are just a sample of a few of them. As you can see, we had over 160 images in this exhibition. And on the second floor of the exhibition, we had additional textual material, not just on the family story, but the history of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. I mean, besides the images, we also had...
My name is Ara Dillion. I live in Fonda, Old Trail, New York. I was born in Marsoobian, and Marsoobian is located probably about 50 miles south from Samsun on the Black Sea. It was a college town, and Anatolia College was very close to our house. In fact, our house was a part of the campus.
Obviously, I can't show this old video, but we had two videos running in a loop. They were about 10 minutes long. One is an interview made in, as you saw, in 1968, audio. It had Turkish subtitles, and it showed many of the images. The second the second video that we had, there was a separate room to show the videos. This is a video that my mother recorded 3 hours recording, we had to pare it down to 10 minutes. Basically, I gave up after cutting my mother down to an hour.
Yeah, because he was the
I
only
let
photographer
them
that
come up with the,
section. That's why
with the
the
rest of
troops
it.
didn't kill him. They
But
just
this is her
took
back
him
in
as a
in
soldier,
86,
and they used
in which she
to-
talks about her memories,
That's
many of
why
them very positive
our family
memories of her
didn't go
childhood
to-
in Marsoobian.
Axel.
They weren't deported.
No. And whoever was there, all my relatives, some of my aunts and so on, uncles, he kept them. He could keep all the relatives. They did in Marsoobian, whoever was. But the others that were in Samson or Sebastian or Harper, they all were deported and were killed, most of them, nearly all of them.
Sorry, Mom. In that video, she talks about coming down the stairs of the family home on cold winter nights when her father, my grandfather, is toasting bread on the oven. She says she is holding her clothes and her shoes. And my grandfather, of course, at some point took this photo of her doing exactly that. And I believe this might work. And then we had a very credible opening of the exhibition. And this is just a video showing the opening day of the exhibition.
This is a promise, an unspoken promise I made to my uncles when this material was given to me.
And I don't mind cutting myself off, okay? But I have to go back to the keynote. Okay. Let me resume. I don't want to take too much time. A second redesign exhibition took place later that year in my family's hometown of Marsoobian, now called Marsoobian, shown here on the map toward the Black Sea. This was the town in which they were forced to flee in 1922 after the Kemalist rise of nationalism. And I'll show you just a few quick images. This is the Tashan in which we held the exhibition, and we had to completely redesign it. There's a lot of graffiti in this 17th century building. It's a marketplace. The graffiti is in Armenian mostly. Some of it is in Turkish. But we had to, because it's a historic building, we had to remount all the images and the texts and hung them from the walls. And I'll skip this bit, but this was the section that dealt with 1915, and a controversy arose because we had left out the word Soykırım, genocide, in all the texts except for one place, which we covered over at the last minute. But I don't want to dwell on that. Lots of school children came, some of the older people from the town. It was quite an event for the community, and it was underwritten by the Chamber of Commerce of the city of Marsoobian. Now, our most recent exhibition ran for 5 weeks in the important southeastern Anatolian city of Diyarbakir, located now in the Kurdish heartland of Turkey. At the time of the genocide, Diyarbakir, known to Armenians as Diyarbakir, was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious city. Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Assyrians all contributed to this ethnic mix. The city today is overwhelmingly Kurdish. Later this year, a newly redesigned, and let me just show you a few quick images of the exhibition in Diyarbakir at the Surp Giragos Church. Again, we're setting it up. This is the church, beautifully restored, but the exhibition took place outside the church. And finally, later this year, in October, a newly redesigned exhibition will open in the political power center of Turkey, its capital, Ankara. This exhibition will take place in Çankaya Municipal Arts Center, which is located quite near the Grand National Assembly, which is the Parliament of Turkey. Now, the book component of my project, memory project, consists of two distinct books. The first is a photography book based on the Dillion photography collection. This book, which is not published yet, consists of 180 pages of photographs and a short history of the family during its years in Ottoman Turkey. The book will be published by an Istanbul-based publisher in a bilingual edition. A second book, which you see the cover of here and is out in the lobby, is a 368-page account of the family story, in which I employed extensive selections from 3 family memoirs. This is all supplemented with background material based upon missionary and government sources, family letters, and other primary and secondary material. And the book is illustrated with 98 photographs and drawings. I call this book a memoir about memoirs, since in telling the family story, I tell my own story of learning the rich history of my family. And a Turkish translation is underway and should appear this summer. I hope there'll be an Armenian translation and also a French version soon. The third and final component of my project consists of memory sites. I have spent days working with local people in Merziphone to identify important Armenian buildings, churches, monasteries, homes, and businesses in the city. We hope to attach plaques to these locations, identifying their former Armenian connections. If possible, we hope to buy and restore an important Armenian home, the home of an academic professor from Anatolia College, Professor V.H. Hagopian, who was a leading scholar and linguist and the country's leading scholar of Ottoman Turkish, and he was murdered during the genocide. Professor Hagopian was a friend and neighbor of my grandfather, and the house hopefully will serve as a guest house for visitors, a resource center about the history of the city, and a repository of copies of the photographs from the Dillion collection. And these are just images of former Armenian buildings. This was the Armenian Protestant Church, which is now a cultural center, but it doesn't indicate at all anywhere on the building that it was the Armenian Protestant Church. This was the Armenian Catholic Church, which has now been converted into a wedding reception parlor. And this is an interesting farm outside of Marsoobian, which was a location, important location in the family story. It turns out it was a monastery at this location. And if you go inside the barn, you will see many of the images of the apostles on the ceiling. So these are 3 chapels, which is now serving as a barn, including this slab that's sitting here in front of Ataturk, who's guarding this Armenian stone, which has the story of a famous Varta bed in it. And this is Professor Hagopian's house. So that's a description of the work I've been doing for the last few years. And what I'd like to conclude in the next 5, maybe 8 minutes, I want to put on my philosophical hat and say a few things about the notion of bearing witness. I contend that collective memory and individual memory do not exist in separate realms, but are intertwined. The collective memory of a group is incorporated explicitly or implicitly in the individual memories of its members, at the same time that they, the individuals, put the stamp of their personal memories on the memories they share as members of the group. My memory work, my memory projects are designed to reach individual Turkish citizens in such a way as to change the collective memory of Turkish society. The ultimate goal is to encourage Turks to take responsibility for their nation's past, and in so doing, to collectively do justice to the wrongs of that past. While this is clearly an overly ambitious goal, one that I do not pretend can be achieved in the short term, or maybe even in my own lifetime, it is still the guiding goal that morally compels my work and the work of my partners in Turkey. One way of understanding the work we are doing is to see it in the light of the concept of witnessing. Much has been written about the concept of witnessing and the particularly moral notion of bearing witness. Aside from our general obligations of remembrance, remembrance in the form of bearing witness is commonly restricted to certain types of situations. What one often bears witness to is the suffering of others or the circumstances of their deaths, usually circumstances involving unjust acts and violations of human rights. I needn't list here all the forms of suffering that I have in mind. We are all too familiar with them. The salient characteristic that marks those for whom one bears witness is the harm suffered under unjust circumstances. Of course, and most importantly for our project, this does not preclude remembering individuals in other more positive ways as well. That is why the photography exhibition does not simply focus on the events of the genocide and its aftermath. We present both the good and the bad. If we had only focused upon the victims of the genocide, the victims of persecution, torture, and murder, we could be seen as victimizing them for a second time. Remembering our dearly departed as fully human, that is, as active and multidimensional individuals, is part and parcel of the moral obligation of remembrance, and it's crucial to restoring the human dignity that the forces of evil try to take away from them. Our exhibition bears witness not just to those who died in the genocide, but just as importantly, to all those who survived. Their fortitude, ingenuity, courage are all witnessed in our project. Needless to say, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for their courage and fortitude. So my memory work serves an important memorializing function. I'm privileged to be able to use the photographic art of my ancestors to carry out this important function. Memorials and memorial art serve many functions. They can be addressed to a small audience, such as a family and friends, or a wider public audience. Not all memorialization entails bearing witness. Crucial to the concept of bearing witness is the idea of testimony. Witnesses are supposed to seek to uncover and relate the truth about what happened or is still happening. It is the obligation to get at and tell the truth about this suffering, a truth that may be hidden or obscured, or is one that others may, for various reasons, not want disclosed. This is especially important in the case of the Armenian Genocide because of the continuing campaign of denial by the Turkish state. There has been a 100-year history of denial of the suffering of the Armenian people. Those who bear witness understand themselves to have a responsibility to find out the truth, tell it, and hold fast to it. The imperative to speak the truth in the context of bearing witness adds a greater burden on those who engage in memory work in hostile or indifferent societies. Memorial art can, and unfortunately often does, turn into propaganda, a trap that must be avoided. Memorial art that seeks to speak the truth, to bear witness, must avoid responding in kind to those who perpetrated acts of unjust suffering. While some acts of bearing witness address a relatively small audience and may soon be forgotten, others target a larger public audience and take on a wider historical importance. They become part of the public record and may be incorporated into or shape the collective historical consciousness. The primary goal of our memory project is to begin a process of gradual change in the collective memory of the Turkish people, a change that is required for building democracy. Understanding the nature of our audience has been crucial for the project. Within Turkey, we have multiple audiences. If we are going to succeed in positively affecting Turkish historical consciousness in whatever small way we can, then we must be nuanced in our approach. Thus, our project has been careful in crafting the testimony art witnessing provides. Unlike other forms of remembrance, bearing witness may have the effect of psychic healing for the trauma of the witness, as well as a reparative effect upon the audience who responds to the testimony. I find this healing true in my own case. I find this whole project healing the trauma that's been passed on to me. I conclude with one last point about the moral value of bearing witness. Bearing witness to the suffering of victims of wrongdoing may be understood in part as a symbolic act whose moral value consists in its expressing one's intrinsically valuable allegiance to the good and the repudiation of the bad. Bearing witness to the suffering of those who were wrong, like punishing those who wronged them, cannot restore the victims to their former state, of course. But bearing witness to the suffering of those who were wrong can symbolize one's commitment to the moral order that was upset by, or the moral norms that were breached by the wrongdoing, and it can symbolize this long after there are no perpetrators left to punish. Thus, bearing witness symbolically asserts the moral status of the victims, that is, their membership in the moral community, by giving them and their suffering a voice. And when we heed that voice, we affirm that moral status, however belatedly. Their voice may have been silenced in the past, but now there is someone who speaks for them and of what they had endured. Thank you.
I think I can speak for everyone in the audience when I express my sincere gratitude to both of you for presenting your extraordinary research and writings this evening. You've given a great gift to the local Armenian American community, and I'm sure you're all very equally grateful as well. We have one last segment to this evening's presentation, and that is to hear from you. I'd like to now open the floor to your questions of our two speakers. You can either raise your hand, you can shout out, and I'd like to ask both of you to field your own questions. Thank you.
I hope my philosophy lecture didn't dull the evening. That's what I do for a living. Technically, it's not illegal. There's a clause, Article 301, about denigrating the Turkish state, which has been used in the past to prosecute individuals, usually Turkish citizens, for publishing or lecturing about the Armenian Genocide. Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize-winning author, was prosecuted under that clause. And Eli Shafak, the But about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, the AKP, the current government, took a different attitude with regard to this question of prosecutions. Basically, they, in the past, anyone could bring charges. So any citizen can say, he was talking about the Armenian genocide, I'm going to bring a case against him. And that changed, and it can only come through basically the Attorney General has to approve any charges. And it became too embarrassing to the government that these charges were being brought. So there haven't been any in the last 4 or 5 years. So in part that accounts for opening up of the discussion about the Armenian genocide. I was in Turkey for 2 weeks just recently, and the 3 lectures I gave, one of them was at a conference. Scholars are talking about it all the time now in Turkey itself, and that's a big change that many Armenians in the diaspora are not fully aware of that's going on in Turkey. There is now a greater openness. It's not the case that the government recognizes it, of course, but they see that stifling academics from talking about it, or for 5 years there have been commemorations in Istanbul of the Armenian genocide that I attended. Sorry for the long answer.
Question for Chris. My parents were survivors of the Holocaust and World War II. So I try to speak to educate people, like you want to educate people about genocide of Armenia. And when I speak about my parents' experience, I hope that generation of my aunts and uncles as well, I always feel as if, how do we relate it to the young people of today? How do we have that lesson come across to them? When we know genocide, I mean, we talk about 1950, my parents were 1939 and 1940s. We have Bosnia, we have Rwanda. I mean, it's still with us, okay? So I always feel like, what do you feel is the most important thing that you think the young people need to hear to make it relevant, so that's actually something they're going to learn from hearing whether
Well,
Armenia or the Holocaust?
Yeah, the question is this, and it's a great question. How do you make the continuum of genocide relevant to young adults? And I think you were brilliantly answering your question when you were talking about that very continuum. The reality of a genocide is that when a genocide is not punished, it opens the door to subsequent genocides. Impunity begets impunity. As Adolf Hitler famously said on August 22nd, 1939, before unleashing his panzers on Poland, be merciless, be merciless. After all, who today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? And I think that's why, as Armenian Americans, it's so frustrating to us that this crime has been unpunished. It's not only the sense that our ancestors' voices were stilled and there was no justice. It is that 20 years later, a mere generation, the Holocaust would begin. And then a generation after that, there are the Cambodian killing fields, and it's on and on and on. So when I try to talk about this with young adults, I always try to make that continuum clear. And the other thing that I think is great to do, and this is why I love so much Armin's book, is the combination of precision and poignancy. It's a memoir, but it is so grounded in the particulars of Armin's family that it's just beautiful and powerful, and I think just it's one of those rare moments that I think scholarship, think Rebecca Skloot, can hopefully cross over into the mainstream.
I have to also compliment your book that dealt with the Holocaust, because Chris hasn't just written a book about the Armenian genocide. He wrote a book that dealt with the experience of the Holocaust, both from the perspective of a Jew, a Briton, and Germans, and that's the skeletons at the feast, which was an important book. So that reaching audiences through literature is important. And I teach a course, I've taught this course now a number of times at Southern on genocide through the arts. And we look at poetry, we look at film, we look at dance, we look at novels. The last 2 times I've taught the course, I've focused more on the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust, and we begin by having the students read over the summer Sandcastle Girls.
Thank you.
And and they loved it. And Chris, I Skyped him into one of my classes at the beginning of the semester, which was great. So I think one venue for this is that through education, and many of our students do not know anything about these events. They learn a little about the Holocaust, but they don't know very much about it. They don't know about Cambodia and Bosnia, which we do. We do Rwanda. So education is so central to this project of remembering and never forgetting these genocides, and then incorporating our political behavior as a country to prevent these events from happening again. And we saw that recently in Iraq and in Syria, and it's still going on.
I wanted to ask, what did the Turks, what did they have against the Armenians to do this to them? Was it a religious element, or was it like American Indians, they were supposedly backward people?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. There's a complicated answer to that question. There are conferences that examine this. But let me just say briefly that religion in this case was used for the purposes of the nationalist Young Turk movement. And clearly there were religious tensions for a long period of time in the Ottoman Empire, and there were persecutions against Christians. But it was informing the Turkish national state. It was an attempt to suppress a minority that was believed to be a threat to Turkey's existence at the time. And part of it was clearly racial prejudice, which we find in the Holocaust. So there are multiple reasons behind it, but it's more a question, I think, of the idea of Turkey for the Turks at this period, and that other minorities, and we shouldn't forget this, were also persecuted at this time. Up to 300,000 Assyrian Christians were killed alongside the Armenians. And a few years later, the Pontic Greeks were also subjected to massacres. Close to 500,000 Pontic Greeks in the Black Sea region were killed. So it wasn't only directed against the Armenians, but it's tied to nationalism primarily.
We'd like to move on to the book signing in a few moments, so we could probably field one more question.
Maybe do
2 more.
All right, 2 more is fine. It's up to you, Chris.
I wondered in your presentation in Turkey last year, were there young Turks in the audience or students like here?
We need a new word for young Turks. We really do. We really do. Young Turkish intellectuals.
No, young Turkish, any young students in that audience, because we were there last summer in that part of Turkey, and in, what town is that? Africa country. Malatya.
Malatya.
And, we were with Turkish people that we knew through American young man in a family. They run a big business of apricots. And he was very amazed that we're there in Turkey, in this little village. He says, why were you here? Why are you here? And he said, he was in his 20s, this fellow. And I said, do you want me to tell you the story? So I tried to be as subtle as I could, because the parents were all there and we were with all of them. And he knew nothing about his, his background and why Armenians left Malatya, and
Yeah.
trying to educate him in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So I think those young Turkish students somehow have to be educated. I don't know how to.
One of the problems in Turkey is the central control of the curriculum through the high school. And the high school textbooks are all, written giving the Turkish government's perspective on this. So generally you will find if you have young people of high school age, they don't know very much about what happened. It's often at the next stage where they're being exposed at college, and there are universities where this is more openly discussed. And then whenever young Turkish men and women travel outside of Turkey, they often encounter these stories. And again, I speak with people who tell me how they came to know about the Armenian Genocide. So it's unfortunate. You saw that image of the 3 young girls at my exhibition that I showed, 2 in headscarves. They all have in their hands the booklet from the exhibition, which tells the whole story. And they came to the exhibition. And it's probably one of the first times they're hearing in more detail the story.
Can I just add one thing to that? If you have a moment, Google Taner Akçam in the Armenian Weekly. Taner is a Clark University genocide and Holocaust scholar. And he recently wrote an article precisely about what Armen is talking about, the centralized Turkish high school curriculum. And he's all these passages about what happened to some of the minorities, quote unquote, during the First World War. And it's astonishing. It is absolutely astonishing the way history is being trampled in modern Turkish high school textbooks. Now, a footnote to that also. What is really, I think, interesting if you are growing up in Western Armenia and you are Kurdish, is trying to understand why, for example, in Çankuş, that Armen and I share, why in Çankuş, which is now, except for Asiya, a Kurdish small city or big town, is there a massive Armenian church ruin? Why is there a massive Armenian monastery ruin? Why is there a smaller Armenian church ruin? Why is there an entire street with 3 doors with Armenian lettering on them? You ask the Kurds, where did the Armenians go? And you will get very different answers, but some of the ones I have gotten include, oh, they all decided to move to America in 1908. One of the 2 times I've been to the Dudon crevasse, when I returned, there were some school children out there, and in our conversations with them about the Dudon crevasse, the response to what occurred there ranged from, oh, yeah, we're not supposed to go there because some people died there once, to, oh, yeah, some Armenian children fell in there. My wife, to this day, it's become sort of this running joke in our family. Whenever somebody says something so patently absurd, it's just, oh yeah, some people fell in.
Just a footnote, even in the Armenian high schools in Istanbul, and there are a number of Armenian schools, the history courses cannot be taught by an Armenian instructor. They're taught by a Turkish instructor, and they teach the required national curriculum. Fortunately, in the English classes, not the English literature classes, the Armenian literature classes, the Armenian teachers do bring in the genocide. Many of the more courageous teachers. So there was one more question. How about in the back? Talene, is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So my name's Colleen. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I actually focus my work in the area of trauma treatment. And I was thinking about your idea of bearing witness, and it really struck a chord with me because one of the core struggles for people who have had traumatic experiences is being very stuck in the past, right? And I was thinking about one of the goals that we have when working with people who've had trauma is to strengthen what's called the observing ego, or the ability to sort of have one foot in the present and one foot in the past, rather than being stuck completely in the past. And when treating people with trauma, one of the responsibilities of the therapist is to work with the person in sort of being that observer initially, and engaging the person and being able to think about and be in the trauma, but also be in the present, you know, is a huge goal of the healing process. So I was thinking about that in terms of your idea of bearing witness, and it seemed almost like strengthening the observing ego of our culture as a whole, and pretty amazing.
Well, thank you for that. And I know growing up as an Armenian American, I encountered people in the older generation who had this trauma that was passed on from their parents' generation. Michael Arlen in Passage to Arad captures this beautifully. And it's something that, fortunately for me and my parents, they, even though they went through some terrible moments, especially my father, he had that perspective about the present and the gratefulness about the present, even though he didn't hide or ignore or not pass on stories about the past. And the same with my mother. If you, those two videos that I showed, they're on YouTube. If you Google Dillion under YouTube, you'll see it. My mother tells some very positive, some very important, happy moments from her childhood that she's talking about. And that kind of optimism, with full knowledge of the past, I think, was the healthy Armenian response that was passed on to me, and it really accounts for the work I'm doing today. So thank you for your remarks.
Thank
A chance for a third?
It's up to you, gentlemen.
Sure.
One more.
I wanted to go back to the topic of history potentially repeating itself. And as far as I know about World War I, at the end of World War I, unlike World War II, where the Allies were able to eat in Germany to make sure that the Nazi Party did gradually go away, there was no observer within Turkey at the time. And so it sounds like the genocides occur, they hold up their hands and they say, okay, we're sectarian right now, let's talk economy. And I'm wondering, as you've been doing your research, how you've been able to understand whether or not the country has progressed towards more sectarian, because right now I don't see any type of true minority footprint in there. And how, whether or not you're able to make any type of strides to have this happen, in order to have a reconciliation. It's nice to talk about, but is there potential there?
I'll start. Why don't you finish?
Okay.
I am not a scholar of Turkish politics or Turkish history. I'm a novelist. I'm not a historian. I don't play one on TV. But what I find fascinating whenever I visit Turkey right now is this interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, there is unbelievably oppressive nationalism and pride. It's especially apparent in Western or historic Armenia, which is now Kurdish. This past autumn, when I was there, I was struck by all of the billboards and all of the carvings into stone, the size of billboards, or all of the landscapes that have been mowed to read, is it Homeland First? Is it Fatherland First? It's either Homeland First or Fatherland First, as if it is Germany in 1937 or 1938. Now, why are they doing this in Eastern Turkey? Because it is Kurdish, and they are so deeply worried about Kurdish rebellion. They're so deeply worried about an independent Kurdistan in what they view as, their land, Turkey. And the Kurds, are living on Armenian land, and it's interesting, in some cases they are very, very welcoming and wonderful when, pilgrims like Armen and I go there, and, they want to show us the Armenian ruins, and once we made it clear, we're not going to pull some document out that says this is our land, we want it back. But here's the other thing. Here's the dichotomy. Armen was talking about how once students get to high schools, once they're in college, once they're traveling abroad, as Shakespeare said, murder cannot be hid long, truth will out. And eventually, whether they're 15 years old or 20 years old, they begin to realize that history isn't precisely what they were taught. And you can see that manifest in, as Armen said, the Armenian Genocide commemorations that have been held in Istanbul the last 5 years, and on the assassination of Hrant Dink. There are maybe 60,000 Armenians who still define themselves as Armenians. I'm not referring to the Islamized Armenians. There are, say, 60,000 Armenians, and most of them live in Istanbul. And on the anniversary of the assassination of Hrant Dink, in all of those marches and memorials, easily 75 or 80% of the people participating are Turkish. They are young Turkish students who, very much like Americans in the 1960s wanted us to address our civil rights cataclysm, want to see their country address its past. And with that, I will turn it over to Armen to...
I don't have that much to add. I mean, it is true that I think the Kurdish issue is the dominant issue with regard to the nation state of Turkey. And there's been much progress with regard to the Kurds in the last few years. As some of you, if you've been following the news from Turkey, there is a call by Öcalan, who is the head of the PKK, to finally end the armed rebellion. And a number of leading Turkish politicians have apologized for the Armenian genocide and have accepted their culpability in it. And there are also other minorities. I know there's only 60,000 Armenians. There are only 8,000 Greeks left. But there are also Circassians, there are Muslim minorities, Alevis, that have also experienced discrimination and persecution. And they're all now, in many ways, trying to regain their voice in the state. So I think there's some progress. It's always a step forward and a step back. As I said, I probably won't be around when Turkey is a fully democratic nation that respects human rights. But I think the direction has generally been positive in the last 5 or 6 years.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all for your questions, and I apologize we don't have time for more. We'll now proceed to the book signing, I believe, out in the lobby. But before we do, could you all join me in congratulating and thanking these two fine gentlemen?